Sit. Sit. That's it. Sit. Sit. It's baby. My story around the search for a healthy relationship began in the negative, observing the many traumatic and abusive patterns within my parents' marriage, within the parental-child relationship. And there's no logical reason to conclude, after being raised in a dysfunctional home, that one knows what one is doing. If one copies the parents, it's irrational to believe in a positive outcome of negative or destructive protocols. And without any formal training, why would one believe that somehow magically it would be any different? My first strategy was to delay romantic relationship. And so I intentionally avoided relationship until age 26 and focused on life skills. My next strategy was to seek to learn. And at the Human Awareness Institute, I learned a variety of things. And one of the things I started to practice was the idea of asking for my 100%. And I think the logic goes that if everyone asks for their 100%, meaning what their ideal is, then in time you will get it. And I spent time with roughly 100 lovers in different countries, 30 within the Human Awareness Institute community of workshop graduates and team members. And I never realized, I never experienced my 100%. There were bits here and bits there, but the 100% never manifested. And this led to frustration. And it was easier at the beginning, of course, because everything around sexuality and relationship was new. But very rapidly, things would plateau, and I would find that I wanted something more, and my partners were not interested either in working to obtain that or, lacked the skill to do so. And this led to frustration. And it was also somewhat of a self-absorbed reference point, because I would reference my 100% and go out and find it and say, no, this is not my 100%, and start over if the partner wasn't interested. Then came a psychedelic experience that included sexual, spiritual, psychological abuse by a high facilitator. And this was followed by a bizarre set of communication controls and kind of crazy-making behavior that left it impossible to deal with the underlying feelings which were emerging as heartbreak and betrayal and trauma unfolded, because it's very difficult to deal with feelings about something if they're mislabeled. And what I mean is that my therapist was calling the abuse love and support, and he was asking me to validate what a great therapist he was. And we are integrative machines. We are, the logic, the mathematics of language, of meaning, of emotion, of biology doesn't say to produce grief and pain for being loved. It says you should be grateful. And so this was part of the unconscious framework of buildup. Because while I was being abused, while I was being traumatized, while I was being abandoned in a crazy-making scenario that first included my therapist and then included his psychic powers, asserting repeatedly in the face of all objective data that I should marry one of the most inappropriate women that I've ever met. These emotions exploded, mushroomed, and this is a problem. How do you process grief around being treated excellently? How do you process rage around sexual abuse that's being called love? It's a problem, and it's not a problem that I was particularly equipped to deal with, because in my workshops at the Human Awareness Institute, they had chosen to omit any language or any vocabulary and paradigm for abuse of power, trauma, PTSD, abuse contracts, shame, and all of the various elements that were going on in the abusive relationship with my therapist. And eventually, when I brought this to the organization, I was roundly blamed and discouraged from bringing it to light in public. And this brought trauma to PTSD, because the most intense pains and confusions of my life were now being abandoned and covered up by the teachers, by the leaders who were, who were my guides of what was and wasn't loving behavior. And so this reduced me to my knees. I couldn't work, I couldn't function in daily life, and I went abroad. Luckily, I had learned that in Asian culture, particularly Thailand, but secondarily in the Philippines, that it was more feminine. There was more focus on feeling. And that's really what I needed, was a focus on the most intense feelings that I'd experienced to date. And so my first step was to train a masseuse who had energetic predispositions on how to do energy work, because in my sampling of her massage, as soon as she touched me, there was a 50% reduction in pain and grief, but she was not aware of that. And so I trained her in grounding and in how to have a competent, platonic, healing relationship with myself, and commenced to do several hundred hours of kind of healing energy massage with her, just to manage the pain. And it was while I was in that state, which kind of consisted in laying in bed or laying on the floor in between healing sessions for well over a month, that I had just been excommunicated effectively through the protocol of secrecy and denial by my primary source of love and belonging, as I defined it at that time, the Human Awareness Institute. And so I really needed some form of bonding, of secure attachment. And so I was looking for that with a much older woman, generally speaking. Someone over 50, in my experience, is capable of more attunement and bonding. And it was at that time where I began reflecting and noting all the areas that my therapists, my community, the curriculum at High had done the opposite of what was intelligent. Meaning I noticed a variety of ways where they had expended energy to make things worse for themselves and for me simultaneously. Much like I learned from my parents, I decided that, the best way to learn from the facilitators at High was to do the opposite of what they were embodying, which clearly wasn't working. So at High, what they were saying was that the fact that we recommended and trained your abuser and that he's a High facilitator is not our issue. We're committed to a world where everyone wins, but we're also committed to a world in which the therapists that we train to abuse you can do so with impunity and have it covered up and not offer a refund, and that we have nothing to do with it. And so this, of course, was incredibly painful and crazy-making. And so I knew it was wrong. It was wrong for them. It was wrong for me. It was wrong for the community, because it spent more energy making things worse than making it better. And the real pivot point came when I analyzed all of the things that they had done and not done. And particularly dysfunctional organizations tend to be poor, because if they were highly functional and competent, we tend to connect that more with success and abundance. Now, there are other reasons culturally why any organization that's focusing on feminine terrain, such as relationship, is underfunded. That's part of our national chauvinism. However, highly successful and competent organizations tend to be more profitable than dysfunctional and incompetent organizations. And the Human Awareness Institute and some of its facilitators at least were quite short on money. And so it becomes valuable for them to expend emotional capital and time capital to repair the damage to a client, because obviously there's not a linear logical equation that says that we need a public nonprofit to sexually abuse therapeutic clients under the influence of psychedelics, and then we need to cover it up so that we can continue accepting donations. It's not a logical equation. No one vouches for that, and so obviously this is behind the drive to cover it all up. However, it seemed like if they made a thorough apology and went public with it, that would do two things. One, it would let me know that they understood the impact. Two, it would bring integrity to this ongoing promise that the facilitators made to be committed to a world where everyone wins, which presumably includes the sexual abuse survivors by their staff. And I wasn't winning, but neither was High. No one was winning around this. But they weren't interested in offering the cheapest, easiest, most succinct investment of time, which was a clear apology. And at that point, I wasn't even asking for it to be in public, though that is, subsequently something that I've revised. Now, if they made an apology and acknowledged the issues, then they could start working on the underlying causes of the abuse. And if they shared with the community what had happened, people would empathize with me in a way that they didn't and would not when the facilitators stayed silent. Now, one of the reasons for this is that in abusive relationships and in therapeutic relationships, which may or may not be abusive, there's often a child-parent projection. And if a child has to decide between sticking up for one of the abused children in the family or cozying up to the abusive parent, out of purely survival instinct, most abused children choose to collude with the abuser in the hope that they will be spared the majority of the abuse. And I watched this with my siblings when I spoke up about the abuses in our family. That my parents targeted their punishment to me for speaking up, and my younger siblings, who were not as aware of the abuse literature, as a general rule, either stayed neutral or actually tried to protect my parents, because my parents rewarded them for doing so. And so in an abusive household, there's often a desire, when there's an imbalance of power, the parent controls the money, the power, etc., there's a tendency to try and please the abuser. In trauma, it's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Fawn being ass licking. And so they were not interested in doing even free things that would make a huge difference to my integration and support. And this highlighted understanding that this was not personal to me, that this was just highest level of competency in terrains of sexual abuse by their core staff, that led to a need to do something about it. And I felt very confident that if I had actually been ethical in this terrain, that the trauma would not have become PTSD, and that I would reintegrate and could bring insights and gifts to the community. Because obviously there was a lot that went wrong, which meant that there was a lot wrong with the training protocol of a high facilitator. And so, and Toyota is not just the leading car manufacturer in the world for no reason. Toyota, when there's a problem, as a matter of protocol, addresses the problem at 5 levels. And so person 223 runs out of bolts on the assembly line, and so the assembly line for the Camry stops. And the question to person 223 is, why are you out of bolts? And then it'll come to fact that, they're out of bolts because person 341 didn't provide the form for filling up the bolts, for refilling the bolts. And then it goes back another step. Why was such and such not filling up the bolts, getting the forms right? Well, the supervisor wanted to save money on the printer, and so got a cheap printer. And why did they do that? Well, the higher ups told them they had to cut operating costs by 5%. And why did they do that? Well, the stock options for the executive team would only exercise by Christmas if the stock price hit this amount. And analysts were wanting to see a cost cutting in this and this. And so it comes all the way back to the short-term thinking of the executives, because all problems are interrelated. And then Toyota tries to solve the problem at that fifth level and then work its way back and say, okay, if we solve it back here 5 layers deep, would the problem still exist? And so, of course, if you apply the idea that the human heart is as valuable as a car, and I know that's difficult for chauvinists to believe, the human heart being the feminine terrain within the psyche, then one should look deeply, not just at why did Peter Sandhill betray his life, his wife, his career, his client, his community, and all of his facilitators, but what were the protocols that led to the choice of Peter Sandhill? And what was the training of Peter Sandhill? And what was the thought process behind recommending Peter Sandhill without caveat and without disclosing a lack of licensing, but doing work that is far more impactful than traditional therapy? And that would start getting at the root issue. But in corrupt power structures where there's a fear of change or loss of authority and a clinging to power, these examinations have to be stalled at all cost and usually at the expense of all involved. So I was beginning to piece this together, still, very hurt and upset. And I was getting clear that nowhere in the community, not the board of directors, not the team, not the community, not the facilitators, was there going to be anything approaching ethics and love, in this domain. And this was the biggest source of pain, because my belonging, my love and belonging in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, love and belonging is level 3, this was just completely decimated. I did not have a single person that was competent to love me in this state. And the real problem was that I wasn't competent either. But I had begun to learn, thanks to a stranger in a cafe who had brought PTSD and trauma to my attention, recommended a book that I read that afternoon. I was beginning to piece together the terrain. And one of the things that's interesting about fractal patterns, and also evolutionary patterns, is that you can look at it this way. Sociopathic cultures and sociopathic parents in a sociopathic environment produce high levels of trauma in their children. High levels of trauma in the children anesthetize the empathic areas of the brain and stimulate the reptilian programs in the reptilian areas of the brain. And so what you raise in a reptilian environment are reptiles. You raise children with high flooding of chemicals for fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, or ass licking, and you don't raise human beings. You don't raise empaths, because it's too painful to be empathic, and empathy doesn't work in a sociopathic environment. Now, once you raise a generation of reptiles, reptiles behave sociopathically and create and reinforce a sociopathic environment. And so it goes, and so it goes. Reptiles create reptiles, and reptiles create reptiles, creating an environment that is self-reinforcing for the fight, flight, freeze, fawn protocol. So how do you get out of the loop? Well, someone has to, at some point, with people capable of doing it. And a reptile is not capable of being an empath. You can't sue the crocodile into not eating your child. But you can do this with a human being. The human being has the capacity of being a reptile, of being a mammal, of just having reactive limbic emotion. It's capable of reason when reptilian drives are not too strong, and it's also capable of empathy and transcendence. And so not being able to in any way force the high community or facilitators to be loving around this deepest of pains, I thought perhaps I could use what I was reading in the traumatic literature to break with the somewhat narcissistic loop of asking for my 100%, to be of service to another human being. And the Philippines being somewhat abusively curated into overpopulation by the Catholic Church, which shames and goes to great length to block contraception, which has resulted in an exploding population which creates high levels of abuse. The Catholic Church, in their focus on dogma over health and human being, has produced a population of Catholics that has a large segment of abused children. And to give a sense of this, the four women I'd spent a little bit of time with, the last four women, one was shot at by dad number 4 with a revolver. One was thrown out of a glass window at age 5. One was raped and abused by a family member and a neighbor. And the other one was preyed on mercilessly and sent to work underage to make money for the family, and just tremendous brutality towards children. Because when you have a poor country with 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 children, often in which several people die, and a Catholic Church that is trying to produce more Catholics rather than to actually take care of its people, you see this massive abuse of power, creating massive levels of poverty, creating massive amounts of systemic violence towards children. And so with this pivot of understanding that part of an abuse protocol is that in a sociopathic abuse culture, the powerful, the bigger, the stronger, the wealthier prey on the weak, on the poor, for their own agendas. This was what was happening at High. But in an empathic culture, the strong, the powerful, the elder, the more competent actually support and advocate and take care of those who are less competent, who have less resources. And so rather than asking for my 100%, I had an intuition that I didn't fully understand because it was a break with the paradigm. When I went on this date, I asked myself a different question. How can I help this woman? And so it was very important for me to make this distinction because I was very clear that this woman was not my 100%, wasn't my 100% sexually, emotionally, logistically, mentally, financially, was not my 100%. So I had this impulse, though, to connect. And so I thought, well, what makes sense is to how can I be of service? And so that began the pivot point. That was the shift from the sociopathic to the empathic environment, to stop asking what was my 100% and to instead ask, in the situation with someone who had more needs than myself, what is their 100%? How can I be a loving, healthy person in this person's life? And I asked that question. And out of this question, there emerged a variety of different opportunities to support her in making a shift in her life. And at the time, this was partly done out of frustration. I was aware that no one had ever done this for me. And I had the sense that had someone done this, that whether it was a parent or a teacher or a friend or a lover or a therapist, that if anyone had done this for me, that my life would be massively healthier. And it would be good for the planet for me to be massively healthier. And so it just seemed like this was the thing to do. And it's out of this process that I want to talk to you a little bit about stages of development, stages of love and stages of maturity. Because one of the things that occurred during the process of all this abuse is I felt like I began to understand what an adult was, not just a grown-up, but an adult. An adult relates to one's inner age, but also relates to one's maturity and values, regardless of what biological age that you are at. And it seemed to me that the infant experience and definition of love is, I need you. I need you. And that's pretty much it. And you should love me and ruin your life or whatever because I need you. So, and of course, every infant needs a parent to make sacrifices or they die. So this makes sense. So I need you is childlike love. I want you, sexually, emotionally, sensually. I want you. I want you to be like this and this. You have adolescent love. I want to explore my sexuality in the way that works for me with your body. I need you, I want you. And you have the young adult love where I'm going to be free and I'm going to be my own person and I'm going to go and do whatever I want to do. And you, the parent, the partner, whatever, should support me. And I've had plenty of young women kind of in their posts online talk about this, like, I'm going to travel the world, I'm going to do this, and I'm looking for someone who supports me to be the person that I want to explore and be. And so the young adult, is about me exploring me. And if you can help me do that, then you can be my boyfriend. But, otherwise, I'm not interested in you or what you need, etc. I'm going to be me. And so you have the young adult version of love, which is kind of the ideal, the puer ideal of, idyllic, self-authentic expression and freedom. And then you have the adult. And what's interesting is the child, the adolescent, the adult, it's all me, me, me. I need this. I want this. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. I'm going to find my authentic self. But of course, a parent, a responsible parent, can't do that. I need you to do this. The infant can't do it. So the adult is the first one that looks out there and says, first of all, the adult is the one that first loves the inner self and says, okay, you and their child, you need this. I'm going to provide it for you. So the adult learns to love the inner child. And then the adult learns to love the inner adolescent. You need this, you want this. Okay, I'm going to responsibly create the experiences that fulfill your lust and curiosity and your desire. Some of that can be in movies. Some of that can be in masturbation and fantasy. Some of that can be appropriately out in the culture, but I will love you, the adolescent. And I, as the adult, will love the part of me that wants to explore and travel this and do that responsibly. So I'm going to love the inner self in its various states of maturity. But having loved the inner self, the natural budding outward and growth process is to then look at how to love others. And there's also this thing called the hierarchy of human needs developed by Abraham Maslow. Every human being in the history of humankind has needed to survive. So to self-love means to take steps to survive. Brushing your teeth, paying your health insurance, eating, sleeping, not overdosing on drugs, to take step on to survive. Driving safely, all of this stuff. And then security and survival. I'm going to develop a savings fund. I'm going to invest in retirement. I'm going to, not break the law in a way that endangers other people so that my security goes up. I'm going to create a sense of love and belonging. First, loving and welcoming the parts of myself, and then finding people in the world that are capable of seeing and accepting parts of me, and where I can also, see and accept parts of them and have a sense of love and belonging. And then I have my ideals, my principles, and so I'm going to love myself by developing self-esteem, by becoming the person I want to be, by being more honest, by following through whatever my ideals are. And every culture has their ideals, and then as individuals we can break from that, transcend that, or pick our own. And then there is the development of talents. Every human being has an ability to give something unique that the ecology of the psyche called forth medicinally. The psyche is constantly seeking symmetry and wholeness in a culture, in a family, in an individual. And so the people that are born into a system which is always sick to some degree, every human system has some degree of unnecessary suffering. And the unique qualities of the children being born in that, if we look at what nature does, for example, when there's clear cutting, nature has a protocol for restoring the old growth forest, which begins by rapidly sowing weeds, then young growth trees that make soil, and brings us back to symmetry. So all ecology is self-healing by nature, including the human body if we give it a chance. So the ecology wants to heal itself. The psyche, human consciousness, is part of the ecology and part of nature. And so within that, if a person exists, there is a medicinal element within that person, and there's a unique strength within that person. And so part of our human need is to find that strength and develop it. And then the next need, having discovered what we're good at, is we want to bring it to others. We want to create abundance. We want to bring it into community. And finally, we want to transcend the limited ego, the limited myopia of the self-defined self, and find something, become a part of something bigger. A religion, an ecology movement, a species, to think bigger than the self, because it's fun, because it's a need to be a part of something bigger than ourselves. And so these are our human needs. And so part of the adult's job, first with oneself and then with another, and then with the larger community, is to participate in meeting these needs. And so I was laying in bed, hardly able to move, in my hotel in Philippines at the time. But I still realized I had more resources and more experience, etc., than the woman that I felt intuitively that I might be of some use to. And so my job was to be an adult, to practice being for another person so as their survival and security, love and belonging, self-esteem, etc., would be met. And love is not just some wishy-washy feeling. There's plenty of people that say they love you, and then you notice you feel miserable after the experience of being loved. And there's something wrong and flawed in the picture. The initial impulse of spontaneous love, which is a feminine feeling, needs to go through a maturation process to become a masculine discipline, or it's not adult love. And so the process or paradigm of love, which makes sense to me, and which I've evolved largely looking at the pain of not being loved, whether it was at home, in therapy, or otherwise, is that it's fine to feel love for someone, but do you love them enough to care about them? Do I love this person enough to care? Or do I say, oh, that's not my problem? Well, that's not caring. That's disowning and dissociating. Do I love enough to care? And it's fine to say, oh, I really care about you. But do I care enough to see you? Yeah. See you in what way? See, we don't teach this in our culture. Well, to really see you. It takes time to see you. What does friendship mean to you? What does a good relationship ending look like? What's on your bucket list? Where are you on your hierarchy of human needs? Are you feeling loved right now? What would have to happen for you to feel this? To care enough to see, which takes time and skill. But seeing isn't love. I see you, but do I see you enough to understand you? So I see you, and then I judge you. That's not love. I see you, and I don't engage. That's not love. Do I see you enough to understand you? And do I understand you enough to empathize with you? Where I see and understand you to such a degree that I empathize with what it's like to be you under the matrix of cult programming and dogma and brainwashing, etc., that every human being within a cultured society is living with. Do I see you enough to understand you? And do I understand you enough to empathize? Because these are natural growths, like a plant. If love blossoms, it turns into care. And if care blossoms, it turns into time and seeing. And if seeing blossoms, it blossoms into understanding. If understanding blossoms and you are not a complete sociopath, meaning you still have access to your empathic brain, understanding always leads to empathy. You know when you understand someone, when you empathize with them. If you do not empathize with them, you do not understand them. You're too focused on yourself, so you're not an adult. I need, I want, I'm being myself. Fine. Child, adolescent, young adult, but you're not being an adult, which is fine when you're 15 years old, 20 years old. But after 25, if you're not an adult, it's a symptom of being in a dysfunctional culture that doesn't initiate grown-ups into adults, that doesn't take the individual to that last step of transcending the myopia of it all being about me all the time. So empathy always emerges with full understanding. And empathy blossoms into attunement. It is inconsistent to say that I deeply empathize with the fact that every time I push this, your pain goes up 20 times, and I'm just going to do it because I really care and I understand and I empathize, and I'm just going to poke you right there where it hurts. You haven't understood. You haven't empathized. With empathy, in a mature sense, it blossoms to attunement. I'm going to change my behavior to shift, to reduce your pain and increase your safety, security, survival. I'm going to adjust. I'm going to attune to you so that my impact on you creates survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem, etc., etc. So this is the journey into adulthood. This is the journey from the naive, patronized, chauvinistically diminished little bud of love, of I feel some attraction, I feel touched in some way, all the way down to the competency. Because I'm not just going to attune out of empathy. I'm going to attune successfully. I'm going to attune enough to become competent at loving you deeply, at bringing you what? Survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem, and of course, to raise an adult, to bring someone else to the point of view where their adult can ensure their own survival, security, etc., means that's when you replicate an adult. That's when the meme of love and adulthood spreads virally from one adult into a newly born adult. And so this was the protocol that I began the relationship with this woman. I wanted to see what the impact was if I actually behaved consistently with what seemed to be making sense in the traumatic literature, etc., that I was studying. And lo and behold, she was receptive. And so her life improved and improved and improved. And over a couple of weeks period, her well-being went up 500-600%. This was phenomenal. And she was actively receiving. She wasn't, it's not sustainable in that paradigm, teach a person to fish and you feed them for a lifetime, give a man a fish, feed them for a day. In that paradigm, to really help someone grow, you've got to support them in learning and then developing the discipline to bring themselves into a state of well-being. And so the ratio was very good, meaning I'd spend 15-20 minutes a day doing free kind of mentoring, loving, coaching, healing, digesting, and feedback, and she'd spend several hours or more, somewhere between 1 and 6 hours a day, implementing, absorbing, improving her life, developing her survival, her security, her love and belonging, her self-esteem, all of these things. And when you competently attune to someone so as to facilitate their survival, security, love and belonging, so all of their human needs, what they feel, what another person feels when you love competently, they feel safe, they feel understood, they feel value, they feel grateful, they feel pleasure, they feel trust. Trust in what? Trust in the underlying field that connects all human beings. Because when you behave as a competent, loving adult, taking love from the initial childlike feminine impulse all the way to the masculine maturity of adulthood, and you love with competence, such that someone's independent survival and security, etc., goes up, the feelings of safety, gratitude, etc., are spontaneous. And they're normal. Any healthy human being who you help. Now, it gets a little tricky in shame-based cultures such as our own, where if you receive help, you're viewed as weak, because to receive is feminine. And in a chauvinistic cult, if you're feminine, you're less than if you're masculine. It doesn't even matter if you're a male or a female. If you're a male and you receive, you're viewed as weak and because you're more feminine. If you're a female and you receive, you're also viewed as weak because you're feminine. It's something that's deeply embedded in chauvinism. So there's a different programming. Thankfully, that's not there as much in Asia, where chauvinism in that way doesn't exist to block or shame receiving. But the emotions of gratitude, joy, etc. are natural. Now, it's also very fun to love and learn to be loving. And so I would say that having watched this woman's life go up exponentially in both well-being and life skills, I also took the protocol of, loving enough to care, to meet and see how I could help, caring enough to see. I asked her to write down all of the most important things that had happened in her life and send them to me, which she did over the next week, writing out a 38-page book on her phone, which helped me see. Now, in talking with her about these experiences, it helped me understand what had gone on and why. In understanding, I immediately felt enormous empathy. Feeling empathic, I asked myself, how would I need to behave with this human being in order to be a positive, balancing, centering force? And then I asked myself, was I capable of doing it? And then I asked myself, was I willing to do it? And when I affirmed all three, I began to behave consistent with what I understood to be a balancing, centering, loving response. But so I loved enough to understand, understood enough to empathize, empathized enough to attune, but I also attuned enough to succeed, meaning with daily feedback. Did this bit of suggestion work? Did this impact you well? Are you surviving more? Is this working, etc.? Are you meeting your human needs stronger and stronger, faster and faster, more and more confidently because I'm here? Or am I disrupting you in some way in the meeting of your human needs? And upon validation of that, continuing what worked, discontinuing what didn't work. Being both proactive and assertive and receptive and listening, a balance of masculine and feminine, I was seeing rapid, stunning results. And I also took this responsibility because I understood from reading her life story that there was not a single competent adult in her life. And there were many crocodiles preying on the abuse dynamics, pulling her down. And I also made a commitment to the best of my ability to not set her up to kind of climb rapidly and crash, but to engage in a way that every interaction would leave her stronger to do her stuff, in a way that would create less volatility if I died. And I didn't know if I would die at the time because I was in such a bad way with the PTSD. And so at some point, I fell in love with her. What I really fell in love with was the beauty of the human spirit that I saw shining through her. Here was someone with amazing odds against her who was the healthiest person in her circle. It's just so beautiful to see that kind of resilience and power and strength. So I fell in love with her beauty. And, when I was clear that I was in love with her, I also understood that my primary responsibility as an adult, being loving, was to see that, the relationship was good for her. And it was not at all clear to me that being romantic with me would be good for her. And so rather than courting or, initiating whatever, what I did was I said to her at some point, I said that if it's good for you, we can be lovers. And if it's not good for you, I will mentor and support you as a friend as long as you are benefiting from that. And there could be downsides because lover relationships are more volatile and tend to burn up faster, in my experience, than platonic friendships. So please think about it and do whatever is best for you. And I asked her what she wanted rather than telling her that I wanted to be lovers, because I didn't want to abuse the influence. And I had been very aware that that Peter Sandhill had abused his influence in a similar role. And so this was a very important thing. And so she got back and said she'd like to be lovers. I outlined the worst case scenario. I said, I have PTSD. I'm erratic because of that. I'm at the worst I've ever been in my life, basically. And you're going to get that me. And, I'm unreasonable in some of my tantrums and this and that. So you really need to understand what you're getting here. What I liked about it was I understood that because she was coming from this kind of abuse environment, that I was meeting her at the worst that she ever would be. Because it was hard to imagine a more abusive environment, and the environment tends to bring out the worst in the person. When I met her, she wasn't at all interested in me. I wasn't at all interested in her. It was not about attraction. It was simply about being of service. But under the influence of the relationship, well-being and life skills were both blossoming. And so I also understood that I was the worst I had ever been in my life. And so I figured this is a great test of a relationship, a long-term relationship, Because if someone can be constructive and accept me at my worst, it's very easy to accept me at my best. And so, when she said yes, that was in the back of my mind. And we spent a month together, and then we spent 2 months together. And then I immigrated her to Thailand, where I much prefer the culture and all of the things there. And she started a business so that she could be, fully independent. And this focus was it was a very clear contract of a relationship that basically said that every month we are in relationship, you need to grow in ways that make you independent of me on all metrics, because I don't want to set you up for a codependent dynamic that's indefinite. There has to be, every month we're both freer and healthier, more resilient, etc. And that requires, a whole set of behaviors, from meditating and doing inner healing and traumatic repair, to reading books, to making money, to learning life skills. And and I took that upon myself as a mentor, whether it was teaching motorcycle driving or car driving, or helping to facilitate that she had passports and things like that. That each step would leave her freer and freer, because the real test as a relationship moves from a semi-dependent relationship to a more mature relationship is there's the love of need, and there's the love of lust and desire, and there's the love of freedom and exploration. But then there's also the adult love that says, I could be with anyone on the planet. I could do anything I wanted. I could live anywhere. And the place I'd like to be is with you. And you can't ask someone honestly that question when they're in a dependent state. They don't know the answer. They're in, at some level, a child, adolescent type, young adult type relationship. And so, that process continues, meaning every single month we've been together since, we got married a couple years ago. Every month we're together, every part of her survival, security, love and well-being, belonging, self-esteem, etc., is growing. And, and with each freedom of independence comes the freedom to walk away from the relationship. And that's the most important thing to set up smoothly in an imbalance of power of any kind, that you can go off on your own at any point and have all that you've learned and grown. Because that moves into the freedom of the adult love, which is one of preference, not one of need or desire or lust or attachment. It's, I really understand who I am. I'm very happy who I am, and I'd like to do this, and I'd like to do that. And I would say that in the process of learning to be an adult for her, because our culture doesn't raise adults, learning to be an adult for her, I learned to be an adult for my inner child and my inner adolescent. Learning to be an adult for them, I'm more of an adult for her. So it's a nice, dynamic back and forth. But learning by giving, and a pivot from the somewhat self-absorbed narcissistic position of what's the best for me, to how can I be a loving adult for you, for another person capable of receiving that and growing, has been one of the greatest honors and joys of my life, and made the pain, the tremendous pain, shame, rage, etc. of the sexual abuse bearable, and has helped me a little bit to transcend the reptilian rage, which includes revenge, because that's the law of the jungle. Trump wrote in The Art of the Deal that his whole motto in life is that anyone who slights him or hurts him in any way, he hurts them 5 times more. And then they're scared to hurt him again. And this is what a scared, abused child does when they're terrified of being hurt. And I certainly have that scared, abused child that's been abandoned and betrayed by parents and teachers and culture and school and my high facilitators. But I also, I guess, have gotten a taste of adulthood. And it's one of the reasons that I'm passionate about, either shutting down or challenging or transforming the curriculum at schools such as the Human Awareness Institute, is so that people have at least the language and the encouragement to explore protocols and opportunities of adult love that facilitates the mutual building and fulfillment of one's human needs.